In light of what's been happening in Egypt and the wider Middle East with the Arab Spring, there is a justification that's wheeled out regarding the US's support of Mubarak and that he represented stability in the region. Of course, as a justification, it falls apart as soon as you examine it closely. However, is there ever a case when you would countenance supporting a tyrant, at least in the short term, because destabilising the region could precipitate catastrophic repercussions for the whole species? And the closest analogue I could think of maybe Pakistan.
Well, you can imagine all kinds of things, but before we even discuss this, you have to decode the terminology at least. The term stability has a kind of technical meaning in foreign policy discourse. What it means is subordination to U.S. interests. That's stability. And in fact, Egypt's a very striking case. So, for example, if you read press commentary and foreign policy commentary, they say exactly what you said. In fact, they go on to say that the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty is the cornerstone of stability in the region. Now, that's a very interesting interpretation, because in the real world, it's the cornerstone of instability in the region. And that's precisely why the Egyptian population is so strongly opposed to it, and why the West so strongly wants it. Just take a look. As soon as the peace treaty was signed, Israeli analysts, strategic analysts, right away began to write about the meaning of it, which is transparent. It removes Egypt from the conflict. Egypt is the only military force in the Arab world, so it eliminates the sole deterrent, and therefore it frees Israel to carry out actions, often very violent actions, without concern. Very shortly they invaded Lebanon on no pretext at all, credible pretext, killed about 20,000 people, destroyed much of southern Lebanon, tried, though failed, to install their own government, and expanded their illegal occupation in the occupied territory, settlements and so on. Well, that's, by the standards of some objective observer, that's instability. But by the standards of the power systems, that's stability. So therefore, it's the cornerstone of stability in the region. Mubarak kept stability. This usage is all over the place. So take, say, Iran, the other huge foreign policy issue. The Iranian threat is supposed to be the worst problem in the world. If you look at foreign policy literature and media, governments, terrible Iranian threat. Well, the Iranian government is certainly a threat to its own population, but they're hardly unique in that respect. So what exactly is the Iranian threat? Well, it's kind of interesting that in all the discussion about it, that question is almost never raised. However, there is an answer to it, an authoritative answer. It comes from the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence. Every year they present to Congress an analysis of the global security situation. The most recent one, of course, discussed the Iranian threat, which they think is very severe. But it's interesting to see what they said. They said it's not a military threat. Iran has very low military expenses, even by standards of the region. It has little capacity to deploy force. Its military strategy is designed to try to hold off a ground invasion long enough for diplomacy to set in. They, of course, talked about nuclear capability. They said if Iran is developing nuclear weapons capability, it would be part of their deterrent strategy. So that's the military threat. Nevertheless, they're a huge threat. Why? They're destabilizing the region. How are they doing it? By trying to improve their relations with neighboring countries. So they're trying to improve commercial, cultural, political, other interactions with Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's destabilizing. Now, when the U.S. and Britain invade the countries, occupy them, half destroy them, kill hundreds of thousands of people, that's stabilizing. And until you understand the terminology, you can't even discuss these questions. Okay. In fact, the whole terminology of political discourse is sort of reshaped so as to make it almost impossible to talk sensibly. So to go back your question, suppose that we had, let's take, say, Pakistan. Pakistan is a very dangerous country, undoubtedly. The main dangers has internal problems, huge internal problems. It's a kind of patchwork of separate, federated units, different languages, different cultures, and so on. But there are two main problems of international concern. One is it's actually the most rapidly growing nuclear power. Pakistan. So a huge nuclear power, growing very fast. It's part of their competition with India. And secondly, it's a substantial, not overwhelming, but a substantial radical Islamist streak. We saw that recently when the governor of Punjab was assassinated. There was enormous. He was assassinated because of his opposition to the blasphemy law and the way it was used to persecute a young woman who was charged. So he was assassinated. There was overwhelming support for the assassins, and a lot of that support was coming from the black-suited lawyers who were being hailed because they led the reform movement that overthrew Musharraf. That's where the support for the assassin was coming from. Well, it's not a majority. They don't get a majority in any election, but it's there. These are part of Reagan's gift to the world. The Reagan administration pretended they didn't know that Pakistan was developing nuclear weapons, though of course they did. And they supported the worst dictator in the history of Pakistan, Zia-ul-Haq, who was radically Islamizing the country with the support of Saudi Arabia, the major U.S.-UK ally in the region. So and in fact, both the U.S. and Britain have tended to support radical Islam for a long period. There's quite a good book that just came out on this by a British diplomatic historian, Mark Curtis. It's also true of on Britain, but it's also true of the United States, and Pakistan's a case in point. So yes, there's a radical Islamist sector, there's a big nuclear power, there's a lot of internal problems. What do we do about this? Well, one thing we do about it is try to exacerbate it. So if you take a look at the problems that Pakistan is facing, it has one stable institution, the military. It's highly stable, highly professional, dedicated to the protection of Pakistani sovereignty, and the U.S. is pushing it to the wall. Overwhelmingly, Pakistanis support the right of the Taliban to defend their Afghan Taliban, not Pakistani Taliban, the right of the Afghani Taliban to defend their country against aggression. They don't like the Taliban, they didn't like the Mujahideen during the Russian invasion, but they do support their right to defend the country against aggression. The United States is demanding that they take part in that fight. Well, that causes tensions. And furthermore, the drone attacks, which are they're just terror weapons. I mean, if there were drone attacks here, there could be one 5 minutes, we wouldn't know about it. That's what drone attacks are. They're terror weapons. And the Pakistanis bitterly resent them, the military too, and not just because of the kind of weapon they are, but just because they're bombing Pakistan. There are pressure on the Pakistani army to participate in the U.S. war, to go into the tribal areas, to prevent bases from which the U.S. troops in Afghanistan occupying army can be attacked. I mean, like if the Russians had tried anything like this during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, we'd have had a nuclear war, Yeah. Nobody would have tolerated it. And the Pakistani army is infuriated. That's dangerous. If they are forced into a military confrontation, they'll fight. Every military specialist on Pakistan points this out. And that could even lead to the leakage of fissile materials into jihadi hands. And this has just happened right before our eyes and is not being discussed. Now, take the bin Laden assassination. Yeah. That was obviously an attack on Pakistani sovereignty. They sent 79 commandos in to assassinate someone. But more than that, they were under orders to fight their way out if they had to.
The American troops.
American commandos, the orders were fight your way out. Fight your way out means you're going to get air support and all sorts of things. You'd be at war with the Pakistani army, and they'll fight. And then comes possible cycle, maybe nuclear weapons going into the hands of jihadis. Well, the Obama administration and Britain were willing to chance that. Is that stabilizing? No. It's quite the opposite. In fact, one of the major experts on Pakistani military, Anatol Yevin, is a military historian in England, one of the main experts on Pakistan. Now, he wrote recently, he has a book that just came out which talks about this in detail. But in an article he had recently, he said that American and British soldiers are dying in Afghanistan to make the world more dangerous for the United States and Britain. Well, we call that stabilization.
The budget cuts in the US and the United States, England. Cameron recently began a series of massive cuts to the welfare state to negate the British budget deficit, as many other countries have. He talks about tough times ahead, and yet, as he is someone born into absolute privilege and comfort, many people, me included, find such comments hypocritical. I mean, what does he know about tough times? And yet there's an argument which states it isn't important because I guess he understands the concept of financial hardship intellectually, and therefore he maybe doesn't need to understand it empathetically. What's your position? Does a politician need to have endured a degree of poverty to make equitable, far-reaching decisions regarding it?
No, not at all. I mean, take, say, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He came from wealth and privilege and big estates in New York, but he was sympathetic to carrying out highly progressive policies that were of great benefit to the population. Maybe it helps to know something about poverty, but it's certainly not critical. You know, in fact, let's go back to the founder, the hero of the modern conservatives, who actually they hate his principles, but they put him up as a hero, Adam Smith. Yeah. I mean, his moral philosophy, which was the foundation of his economic theory, was based on the assumption that core human emotion is sympathy. Actually, David Hume, the other major founder of classical liberalism, is the same thing. And that is indeed a core human emotion. It takes real effort to drive that out of people's heads. In fact, it's kind of striking to see it. It takes, say, the United States, and no better. The early Industrial Revolution in the United States was right around here, eastern Massachusetts, the latter part of the 19th century. At that time, that was the period of the freest press in American history. Lots of newspapers, popularly run, lots of engagement, lots of readership. Much of the press was coming out of the labor movement, workers in factories and so on. What they called factory girls, young women from the farms, moving to the textile factories, Irish artisans from Boston and so on. They were running the papers. They bitterly condemned the new industrial system, which was destroying their culture, their lives, enslaving them, and so on. But one of their main complaints was against what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. And that's totally inconsistent with their just normal feelings. Now, it's taken 150 years to try to convince people that they should be committed to the new spirit of the age. And it's still going on massively. That's why you have tax on Social Security, on pensions, and so on. Those are all based on, the attacks are based on the new spirit of the age after 150 years. Ordinary people don't feel that way. They think we ought to have responsibility for a disabled widow across town who doesn't have enough money to eat. But from the point of view of those who Adam Smith again called the masters of mankind, they follow their what he called their vile maxim: all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. That's the new spirit of the age. And from their point of view, why should I care about the disabled widow across town? And why should I care if the kid across the street has a school? I don't have kids in school. Why should I pay taxes for that? That's the new spirit of the age. And I don't think that has much to do with whether you grew up in wealth or poverty. It has to do whether you are willing to allow your basic human consciousness and understanding to prevail in your ordinary life, rich or poor.
Sort of on the same theme, but the banks are once again reverting to their previous position of huge bonuses and short-term greed, whilst the rest of us are beginning to feel the effects of the austerity measures, with large numbers of workers losing their jobs or having pay and conditions severely affected. And yet I'm just shocked by how brazen the corporate world appears to be, with Goldman Sachs 15 billion in bonuses, just one example. They appear to have absolutely no concern over the growing hatred and anger that exists within the population towards them. Now, I've heard you state that their raison d'etre is to create profit for their shareholders and companies in the short term, so problems that only may reach their zenith in a generation's time are irrelevant to the exigencies of now. However, this anger that I mentioned, if mobilised into action, could severely damage them in the short term, and is very hard to predict. Mm-hmm. Don't they care, or are they counting on the general public remaining atomised and passive?
Sure, that's what they're counting on. Foreign policy works the same way. Actually, I was in England for a week a couple months ago. Every day, the front page story about some scandal at Barclays Bank, paying executives huge bonuses while people are suffering. That's the way the system's designed. And they are, yes, counting on the passivity of the public. Actually, there's a doctrine that was expressed pretty clearly with regard to the Arab Spring. It was expressed by a man named Marwan Muasher, who's the chief Middle East analyst for the Carnegie Endowment, former Jordanian high official. I forget his exact words, but what he said is, as long as the population is quiet, you can do anything you want. And that's correct, domestically too. Egypt is a very striking case. This the support for Mubarak is not coming out of nowhere. Back in the late 1950s, President Eisenhower was concerned about what he called a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not in the governments, they're okay, but among the people. And at the same year, the National Security Council, NSC, main planning body, it came out with a study of this, and they explained it. They said the campaign of hatred is based on a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh, brutal dictatorships, and we block development and democracy. Now we do this because we want to ensure control over their resources. And it went on to say that the perception is more or less accurate, and furthermore, that's what we should be doing. We'll count on the dictatorships to control the population, and count on the Muasher doctrine, and that's fine. That's why Obama supported Mubarak to the bitter end. Count on the dictatorship to control the population. And it continues to go on. And it goes on domestically. As long as the population is, maybe they're angry, maybe they're frustrated, maybe they hate institutions, as long as they don't do anything about it, the masters of mankind will pursue their vile maxim.
Moving on to Iraq, I was discussing my position recently regarding the Iraq war, that in my opinion Blair and Bush should be at The Hague in front of the ICC, not that I ever expect this to happen. I was asked whether I wanted every leader of every country that was a member of the coalition of the willing to be placed on trial. What about countries that were a member of the coalition but didn't fight, like New Zealand, or countries that didn't have an army, such as Micronesia and Palau? What would your answer be?
Well, basically the Nuremberg principle. They didn't put everybody on trial. In fact, lower level people were not tried at Nuremberg. The people who were tried were the leaders, the decision makers, the people who were sitting in the room while the decision was made to invade Poland. People like von Ribbentrop, foreign minister, who was hanged incidentally. That's several charges, but the crime against peace was he was there when the decision was made to invade Poland. He supported a preemptive war against Norway. The Nazis knew that the British were planning to invade from Norway, and they invaded first, preemptive war. Well, Colin Powell was more guilty than he was. But they didn't, the people who threw bodies into the crematoria, they weren't charged at Nuremberg. Some were charged elsewhere, but and certainly not collaborators here and there. Right. And the same principle is true here. I mean, Blair and Bush and their close associates made the decision to invade another country to carry out the supreme international crime of Nuremberg, which, remember, as defined at Nuremberg and found its way into international law, that supreme international crime, according to the tribunal, it's aggression, but it's more than that. They said it's different from other war crimes because it encompasses all of the evil that follows. So in the case of Iraq, it encompasses the destruction of the national heritage, the sectarian warfare which tore the country to shreds is now spread over the region. These are huge consequences. Millions of displaced people, maybe hundreds of thousands or more killed, all of those are consequences. That's really serious. Yeah, sure, there should be, if law meant anything, they would be.
Yeah.
In fact, again, the Nuremberg principles are interesting. The chief counsel for the prosecution, Justice Jackson, U.S. Justice, he made a pretty impassioned appeal to the tribunal, saying, we're handing these defendants poison chalice, and if we ever sip from it, we have to be subjected to the same principles, or else the whole trial's a farce. It's not his exact words, but something like that. So we have a choice. Either the trial was a farce, and we murdered the Nazi defendants extrajudicially, or else you're right, it should apply to us.
Staying with Blair, I heard a recent interview with John le Carre, who stated that after seeing Blair's performance at the Chilcot inquiry on Iraq, he wouldn't want to interview or ask him anything. I take it he meant that Blair had covered all the angles, sealed off the monolith, and he was now impenetrable. If you had a chance, would you ask Blair a question?
No, I wouldn't ask Goebbels a question either. Not that he's the same, but it's the same principle. Yeah, I mean, their business is to protect themselves, to produce answers which don't make any sense. Yeah. In fact, I don't think there's much point talking to the journalists and intellectuals who supported the war. I mean, you can always make an excuse for anything. Yeah. But what information are you going to get from them?
Moving on to Palestine, I asked you a question in a past email regarding the ongoing Israeli atrocities towards the Palestinians and the fact that Israel always resort to their tiresome line of defence regarding Hamas and their aims being the destruction of Israel. I wondered why Hamas wouldn't just shout their rejection of violence and their willingness to go along with whatever the Palestinian people want from the rooftops. You stated that you agreed that they, Hamas, should shout it from the rooftops, though it wouldn't be listened to. I'm not sure about this, though. Wouldn't it be the case that if Hamas were absolutely unequivocal about their commitment to non-violent resistance, the Israeli and the compliant elements of the world's media would not be able to offer any justification for their violent actions? Hamas could, in effect, call Israelis bluff.
I think it would have zero effect. And there's no particular reason why they should humiliate themselves. I mean, if you want to play the game of commitment, but I mean, Hamas has already for years come out in favor of the international consensus on the two-state settlement. They say they don't want to recognize Israel. I mean, does the Democratic Party recognize Pakistan? The political parties don't recognize countries. If they're part of a government that recognizes Israel, okay, that's all that matters.
Couldn't they just say we recognize Israel? It doesn't
Why
mean
should
anything
they?
in concrete.
I don't think they should. Should the Democratic Party recognize England? No. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Why? This is simply a means of trying to humiliate them and prevent diplomacy. These are ridiculous demands. Furthermore, if we want to pursue this line of reasoning, let's take the ruling party in Israel, Likud party. They have a program. I mean, their official program on which they won the election, is that there cannot be any Palestinian self-determination anywhere in the land of Israel. Well, what's the land of Israel? Maybe they meant the Jordan to the sea, but if you go back to the Likud charter, which they've never withdrawn, that includes Jordan. So they're committed to the destruction of all Palestinians. And further, it's not just a verbal commitment, they're carrying it out. And they have the goal to say Hamas is committed to our destruction. I mean, you can't even laugh, you know. And a lot I don't like about Hamas, but to ask them to accept these terms is just an effort at sheer humiliation. Why should they accept it? I mean, you could say the same about other countries. Suppose that the United States insisted that Mexico recognize the right of the United States to exist sitting on half of Mexico conquered in a war. Why should they? They'll never do that. They recognize the United States, but not its right to exist sitting on half of Mexico. Suppose that Iran was powerful enough so that it could demand that we recognize Iran as an Islamic state. Should we do it? No. Why should we? And why should anyone recognize Israel as a Jewish state? I mean, there's no reason to set up these standards. These are just various techniques that have been designed to try to evade diplomacy.
You mentioned in a recent interview that Reagan's deification is in marked contrast to public opinion during his lifetime and diametrically opposed to his actual achievements whilst in office. You stated that having gods to worship is the easiest way to distract people. Why Reagan, though, and Kennedy? Why not Carter or LBJ? Is it because they most easily fit brand America?
Well, Kennedy is deified mostly among kind of liberal intellect, sort of the educated sector. And he knew what he was doing. He realized that if he sort of buttered up the intellectuals, he'd get a good press. And if you look at the whole creation of the Camelot image, that's just what happened. I mean, it was right here in Boston. It was dramatic. There was a shuttle, a plane that went from, Eastern shuttle, went from Boston to Washington every day and back. In the morning, the Harvard and MIT professors would get on the shuttle to go down to Washington, have lunch with Jackie, talk to the great man, and come back in the evening and tell us how marvelous Camelot is. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little, but that's kind of what was going on. And it ended up with Kennedy having a very good picture of the administration. The crimes just suppressed. He was a very dangerous man. I mean, could go through it, but his administration brought us pretty close to nuclear war, needlessly, apart from a lot of other things. But maybe scholars know about it, but it's not the image. What about Reagan? Well, Reagan, he was not particularly popular. There are polls in the United States. You can check them. They've been studied. In fact, when he left office, say around 1990, he was, polls show that he was actually the most unpopular living president, apart from Nixon. He was below Carter and so on. But then a huge campaign developed called the Reagan Legacy to try to turn him into a kind of Kim Il-sung figure. So if you read publications from, say, the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, he's described as a colossal figure, hovers over us like a friendly ghost. I mean, that's the kind of thing you might get out of North Korea. But now here you get it out of the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And there's been, he's presented as the model of free enterprise, limited government, and so on. Actually, he tripled the deficit. The government grew under his regime. He was the most protectionist president in post-war American history. He doubled import restrictions to try to salvage incompetent American management, which couldn't compete with the Japanese. In the international sphere, he was just a mass murderer. I mean, in Central America, he had a war on terror. It killed a couple 100,000 people. It's being suppressed, like in this morning's newspaper. If you read the New York Times, you notice a little item about the arrest of 20 Salvadoran soldiers for the murder of 6 Jesuit intellectuals in 1989. It happened to be slightly after Reagan left, but those are the policies that the Reagan administration was initiating. The killers, they didn't say it in the paper, but the killers they came from a battalion, the Atlacatl battalion, which had already killed tens of thousands of people. It was one of the most brutal, vicious battalions, armed and trained by the Reagan administration. They had just come from upgrading their training at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare School in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So it ties it together nicely. Came back to El Salvador, given orders by the High Command, which was in close contact with the U.S., to break into the university and assassinate the Jesuit intellectuals. Now, this is a week after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It not only destroyed, essentially wiped out liberation theology, which was a great fear for the U.S. back from the early 1960s when it began. They were adopting the preferential option for the poor. You know, they were trying to go back to the Gospels. The U.S. fought a major war against the church. This was the last, plenty of religious martyrs. This was the last, pretty much the last step. That's of enormous historic importance. It's out of history. And that's just a piece of Reagan's legacy. I mean, Reagan was one of the strongest supporters of apartheid. In order to increase support for the apartheid regime, Reagan not only had to even violate congressional sanctions, which he did, and there was a justification, war on terror. 1988, the White House condemned the African National Congress as, the words were, one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. In fact, Mandela himself just got off the terrorist list about 2 years ago. He can now come to the United States without a special visa. So in order to fight the war on terror, they had to support apartheid. And not only did that support crimes inside South Africa, but it also supported South African rampaging in the neighboring countries, which, according to a later UN analysis, led to 1.5 million deaths. In the Middle East, strongly supported Reagan supported the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and of course participated in it, vetoed Security Council resolutions and so on, the usual, and in fact continued to support it until it was becoming harmful to American interests by mid-August. So he ordered Begin to call it off.
What year was that? What year was it?
1982, August 82. And of course Israel obeyed, they have to. So he's, gave him the go-ahead, called it off when it was done. Another 20,000 people, his record. It goes on and on. And this guy's a serious mass murderer, and certainly to call him an image of free trade, and actually the deficit, up until Reagan, the United States had been a creditor country, the world's leading creditor. Reagan very quickly turned it into the world's leading debtor. That's fiscal responsibility, and also tripled the national debt. But you concoct imagery, you can do anything you like. That's what public relations is about.
Moving on to the media, I'm completely in accord with your position regarding the subjugating force of the mass media, especially the role the tabloid media plays, whereby it uses utter trivia to distract and render supine the elements of the population who should feel most aggrieved. However, I've been told in the past that I'm trying to impose my own set of values and agenda upon people, and if they buy papers that headline with stories about the licentiousness of celebrities or the apotheosis of sports stars, that's because they're enacting their rights as free individuals to choose that paper and that story. If they want to know about human rights abuses in Iraq, they'll buy, in the UK anyway, The Independent or The Guardian. In addition, newspapers are businesses in a cutthroat, diminishing industry. Why shouldn't they maximise their profits by giving people stories they want to read about? Why should they feel obligated to depress people with stories of war and destruction? How would you respond to that?
First of all, it's interesting to look at the history of the British tabloid media. You go back not very far to the 1960s. They were left liberal newspapers.
The Herald.
The Mirror and the
Herald.
Well, the Herald was a social democratic newspaper. Actually, it was the most popular paper in England. It a lot of popular support that disappeared, I think, in the early 60s. But it just couldn't meet it couldn't compete with capital concentration and advertiser reliance. So it didn't matter how much public support it had. James Stern's written a lot about this. But even the tabloids, they were left newspapers. It was the same here. The New York Post, which is now like rabid right-wing lunatics, I think Murdoch owns it, When I was growing up, it was a kind of left liberal New Deal paper. Human beings haven't changed their genetic character. They're just given different choices. As I mentioned, in the period of the really free press, late 19th century, the labor press was quite impressive. I've, frankly, myself, in discussing the media, not talked about this much. I'm much more interested in the elite media. And there, a very interesting question comes up. So take, say, the New York Times and counterparts elsewhere, which sort of sets the agenda with regard to serious issues. How do they do it? What's their commitment? In fact, do they have a commitment? So, if you're, say, a journalist in Iran, let's say, what is discussed is determined by the Guardian Council. The ruling clerics decide what you discuss. In the United States, free country, it's not done that way, but there's still a sovereign. It's what's discussed within the Beltway, what's discussed between Democrats and Republicans and the corporate sector. That's what you discuss. If it's something else, and that's what's called objective, unbiased. Anything else is sentimental. And so on. And it's very interesting the way it turns out. So take right this minute, take a look at the New York Times on the web. You'll see that they're featuring one of the things that the sovereign says is important is Israel-Palestine. Obviously that's important. So they feature a debate about it. And the debate is called Barak versus Bibi. So the two poles of the debate are Obama and Netanyahu. Now from the point of view of the Arab world, they're both at the same pole, I mean, they're both traditional U.S.-Israeli rejectionists. And from the point of view of history, that's correct. And for 35 years, the U.S. and Israel have been blocking a political settlement. Barak and Bibi represent, it's kind of like a debate between two Iranian clerics over some obscure point of theology. I mean, maybe from their point of view, that's a debate, but not from the point of view of the world or even the interests of Americans. I mean, that they may think so, but that's because it's all they're fed. Very few people know that both of them have been leading, they and their predecessors have been leading the rejectionist camp for 35 years. Well, okay, that's kind of objectivity, if you like, but highly skewed. And it's not very surprising. I mean, after all, the reason the Daily Herald went under is because it couldn't compete with concentration of capital and advertiser reliance. And that tells you a lot about what the media are. Actually, media can survive. I'm not so convinced that print media can't survive today. Actually, I was in Mexico over the weekend. I go there fairly frequently. And they have a very good newspaper there. I think it's the best one in the hemisphere, La Jornada. It's very high quality. I thought the editors know the journalists, really good people. It's the second largest newspaper in the country. Has virtually no commercial advertising because business hates it, but it relies on reader support. Maybe they have some other kind of support. And it's a very high-level newspaper, high-quality newspaper. Well, actually, for example, this Salvadoran report in the Times, I read about it a couple of days ago there. And very often I find out things that never even appear here. So I'm skeptical about the economic issues.
Thank you so much, Noam. Enjoy it. Thank you.